A city built from river mud and reed, raised on the flat, featureless plain between two great rivers, once commanded the obedience of kingdoms stretching from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt. Its king inscribed his laws on black stone so that the weak would not be crushed by the strong. 1,000 years later, another king clad its gates in blazing blue and gold, and the world called it the greatest city on earth. And then it fell, almost without a fight, to a conqueror who claimed its own god had chosen him. This is Babylon. What follows is the complete story. Not a glimpse, not a fragment, but the full arc of a civilization across more than 4,000 years. It begins long before Babylon existed, in the reed marshes where the first cities on earth took shape, where writing was born and the first temples rose from the mud. It traces the empires that unified these lands and then shattered, the tribal migrations that planted a small, obscure settlement on the Euphrates, and the extraordinary ruler who forged that settlement into the capital of an empire. It moves through centuries of foreign domination, through destruction and rebuilding, through the astonishing Renaissance that produced the Ishtar Gate, the Great Ziggurat, and the deportation of an entire people whose exile reshaped 3 world religions. It follows Babylon through its conquest by Persia, through the death of Alexander the Great within its palace walls, and into the long silence of sand and ruin. Every time a clock divides an hour into 60 minutes, every time a circle is measured in 360 degrees, every time a legal code governs the rights of ordinary people, Babylon speaks. Its intellectual legacy flows through Greek philosophy, Persian administration, Jewish scripture, and modern science. The city is gone. What it built endures. If you value complete journeys through the rise and fall of civilizations, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Each week, we walk the full lifespan of a world that shaped history. Let us begin where all of this began, in the marshes and mud of southern Mesopotamia, where the first cities rose. Long before any king carved his name into stone, long before any city raised its walls above the floodplain, there is only the river. The Euphrates spills southward from the highlands of Anatolia, slowing as it reaches the vast, flat, alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia. Here, where the gradient nearly vanishes, the water spreads into marshes thick with towering reeds, and the silt it carries builds new land with each seasonal flood. The air is heavy, hot, and still. The horizon is an unbroken line in every direction. There are no mountains, no forests, no stone. There is only mud, water, sky, and the green tangle of reed beds stretching endlessly under a white sun. Sometime around 4,500 years before the Common Era, small communities of farmers and fishermen begin to settle along these waterways. They build homes from bundled reeds and sun-dried mud brick. They dig shallow canals to channel floodwater into fields of barley and emmer wheat. At Eridu, near the edge of the southern marshes, they raise a modest mud brick shrine, barely larger than a single room, and dedicate it to Enki, the god of fresh water and wisdom. This small platform at Eridu, rebuilt and expanded over centuries into an ever larger temple, represents one of the earliest known acts of monumental sacred architecture anywhere on Earth. Over the following millennium, these scattered villages grow. Uruk, some 80 kilometers northwest of Eridu, undergoes a transformation without precedent in human history. By roughly 3,200 years before the Common Era, Uruk is home to perhaps 40,000 people. the largest concentration of humanity the world has ever seen. Its sacred precinct, the Iana district, contains the Great White Temple, perched atop a massive mud-brick platform, its walls gleaming with whitewash visible for kilometers across the plain. Within the temple precincts, administrators press wedge-shaped marks into soft clay tablets, creating the earliest known writing system. These archaic cuneiform signs record quantities of grain, livestock, and labor, the accounting tools of an economy too complex for memory alone. The engine driving this growth is irrigation. Teams of laborers dig and maintain canals that carry Euphrates water deep into otherwise barren land, transforming desert into fields of grain and groves of date palms. The surplus feeds specialists who never touch a plough, potters, weavers, metalworkers, priests, and the scribes who track it all. The temple stands at the center of this system, collecting harvests, redistributing rations, and organizing labor. The Ensi, a priestly governor, and later the Lugal, a title meaning great man, emerge as political authorities who mediate between the divine and the human, between the storehouse and the field. By the early dynastic period, beginning around 2,900 years before the Common Era, southern Mesopotamia is a landscape of rival city-states. With its royal tombs filled with gold, lapis lazuli, and the sacrificed bodies of courtiers, displays staggering wealth. Lagash and its neighbor Umma wage border wars over fertile canal land for generations. Nippur, sacred city of the god Enlil, serves as a neutral religious center whose blessing legitimizes kingship. The Sumerian king list, compiled centuries later, records dynasty after dynasty ruling from these cities, each claiming cosmic authority, each eventually falling. These cities share a common culture, the Sumerian language, cuneiform script, a pantheon of gods, and a legal tradition rooted in written contracts and witnessed agreements. They trade copper from Oman, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, timber from Lebanon, and carnelian from the Indus Valley. Their merchants travel by reed boat along rivers and canals, and by donkey caravan across the steppe. Yet no single city can hold the others for long. The political landscape remains fractured, competitive, and volatile, a constellation of proud, independent urban centers, each convinced of its own divine favor. Somewhere along the middle Euphrates, in the shadow of these far older and grander powers, a small and unremarkable settlement sits on the riverbank. It has no great temple, no famous king, no entry in the Sumerian king list. Its name, if it is spoken at all, carries no weight. The foundations of what will one day become the most celebrated city in the ancient world already rest in the mud, but no one yet knows it. The fractured world of competing city-states does not remain fractured forever. Around 2334 before the Common Era, a man rises from the city of Akkad, a settlement whose exact location remains unknown to this day, and shatters the old order entirely. His name is Sargon. Later tradition holds that he was born in secret, placed in a basket of rushes sealed with bitumen, and set adrift on the Euphrates, rescued and raised as a gardener before ascending to power. Whether legend or memory, the story speaks to something unprecedented. A ruler whose authority derives not from ancient dynastic lineage, but from sheer force of will and military genius. Sargon conquers Uruk first, dismantling its walls. Then Lagash, Umma, one by one, the proud Sumerian cities fall under his control. But he does not stop at the southern marshes. His armies march northwest along the Euphrates into Syria, reaching the cedar forests of Lebanon and the shores of the Mediterranean. To the east, they push into Elam. For the first time in recorded history, a single political authority stretches from the Persian Gulf to the upper reaches of Mesopotamia and beyond. This is the Akkadian Empire, the world's first multi-ethnic imperial state, administered in the Akkadian language, governed by appointed officials rather than local dynasts, sustained by a standing army and a network of roads and garrisons. The bronze head discovered at Nineveh, believed by many scholars to represent Sargon or his grandson, captures something of this new imperial confidence. Serene, bearded, majestic, with elaborate braided hair and empty eye sockets where precious stones once gleamed. It is the face of centralized power. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, pushes the empire to its greatest territorial extent around 2250 before the Common Era. His victory stele, carved in pink limestone, depicts him ascending a mountain, towering above his soldiers and enemies alike, wearing the horned helmet of divinity. Naram-Sin is among the first Mesopotamian rulers to declare himself a god during his own lifetime, a radical departure from Sumerian tradition. Yet the dynasty he inherits proves brittle. Within decades of his death, the Akkadian Empire fragments. The Gutians, a highland people from the Zagros Mountains, sweep into the lowlands. Central authority dissolves. The great experiment in imperial unification collapses after barely a century and a half. From this chaos, the ancient Sumerian south reasserts itself. Around 2112 before the Common Era, Ur-Nammu founds the third dynasty of Ur and begins rebuilding not just a kingdom, but an entire administrative civilization. The great ziggurat of Ur rises from the flat plain, a massive stepped structure of mud brick with a baked brick facade, its corners oriented to the cardinal directions, its triple staircase converging at a gate high above the ground. It is the most imposing structure in Mesopotamia, dedicated to the moon god Nana. Ur-Nammu also composes the oldest surviving law code, predating Hammurabi's by roughly 3 centuries. Its provisions address murder, robbery, assault, and divorce, and they prescribe monetary fines rather than physical mutilation, a legal philosophy distinct from what follows. His son Shulgi reigns for nearly 48 years and transforms the state into a bureaucratic machine of extraordinary precision. Standardized weights and measures govern every transaction. Tens of thousands of clay tablets record the movement of livestock, grain, labor, and textiles through state workshops and storehouses. Scribal schools multiply. Messenger routes connect provincial capitals to Ur. Trade networks reach the Indus Valley, the Gulf, and Anatolia. The Ur Third Dynasty becomes the most documented state in all of 3rd millennium Mesopotamia. But the system's very rigidity becomes its weakness. By the late 21st century before the Common Era, Amorite pastoral groups press against the empire's western and northern frontiers. A massive wall, called the Repeller of the Amorites, is built across the northern plain, but it cannot hold. Simultaneously, the Elamites gather strength to the east. Around 2004 before the Common Era, an Elamite army sacks Ur. The last king, Ibi-Sin, is carried away in chains to Elam, where he dies in captivity. The lament for Ur, one of the most haunting compositions in world literature, mourns the city's destruction, its temples defiled, its people scattered, its streets choked with the dead. A great civilization has ended, and in the wreckage, new powers begin to stir. The wreckage of Ur's fall scatters power across the alluvial plain like shards of a broken vessel. No single city commands obedience. No single king holds the land together. The century that follows is a time of fracture, of ambition, of restless movement. And from this disorder, a world takes shape that will eventually produce the most famous city in human history. The Amorites are already inside the gates. For generations they have drifted eastward from the dry steppe of western Syria, pastoral herders driving flocks of sheep and goats along seasonal routes, speaking a West Semitic language distinct from the Akkadian of the river cities. The III kings regarded them as barbarians, building walls to keep them out. But walls failed. The Amorites did not arrive as a single conquering army. They filtered in as mercenaries, as laborers, as settlers along the fringes of irrigated land, as opportunistic chieftains who married into local families and adopted local customs. When the old order collapsed, they were already positioned to seize what remained. Within a generation of Ur's destruction, Amorite leaders sit on thrones across southern Mesopotamia. At Isin, a dynasty claims to be the legitimate successor of Ur, maintaining the old Sumerian scribal traditions and issuing law codes. Ishbi-Erra, the founder of the Isin dynasty, had been a general under Ibbi-Sin before breaking away. His successors govern a diminished but culturally rich kingdom, copying hymns, compiling king lists, and honoring the old gods. Farther south, at Larsa, another Amorite dynasty rises, controlling the rich agricultural lands near the Persian Gulf. The two cities contest each other for decades, fighting over canal rights, border towns, and the prestige of holding Nippur, the sacred city of Enlil, whose possession confers religious legitimacy on any ruler who claims it. Beyond the southern heartland, Amorite kingdoms proliferate. At Eshnunna in the Diyala River Valley, rulers build palaces and issue their own legal codes. Far to the northwest, on the middle Euphrates, the city of Mari becomes a thriving commercial hub, its Amorite kings presiding over a vast network of trade and diplomacy that stretches from Anatolia to the Gulf. The political landscape is a mosaic of competing powers, none strong enough to dominate, all locked in shifting alliances and betrayals. Amid this turbulence, on the eastern bank of the Euphrates, roughly midway between the northern and southern extremes of the alluvial plain, sits a settlement so minor that it barely registers in the records of its time. Bab-Ilim, the Gate of God. It is not ancient like Eridu. It is not grand like Ur. It possesses no famous temple that draws pilgrims from distant lands, no legendary dynasty stretching back to the dawn of kingship. It is a modest town of mud brick houses clustered along a branch of the Euphrates, surrounded by date palm groves and irrigated fields. Its position, however, is quietly strategic. It sits where the Tigris and Euphrates draw closest together, at the nexus of trade routes running north to Assyria, south to the Gulf, west to Syria, and east to the Iranian highlands. Around 1894 before the Common Era, an Amorite chieftain named Sumuabum establishes himself as ruler of this small settlement. He builds walls, he digs canals, he makes no grand claims of universal kingship. The dynasty he founds is modest in every respect, 5 rulers spanning roughly a century, each one consolidating a little more territory, strengthening defenses, expanding irrigation works. Sumuliel succeeds him, then Sabium, then Apil-Sin, then Sin-Mubalit. Their names appear on year-date formulae recording canal construction, temple repairs, and minor military victories over neighboring towns. None of them conquers a great city. None of them defeats a major rival. Yet something is accumulating. Each generation adds another layer of administrative competence, another ring of fortification, another canal feeding water to fields that feed a growing population. Babylon's scribes learn the cuneiform traditions inherited from Sumer and Akkad. Its merchants trade along the river routes. Its temples honor Marduk, a deity of no particular distinction in the broader Mesopotamian pantheon. Not yet. The great cities of Isin and Larsa continue their rivalry, exhausting each other in wars that drain treasuries and divert canal water. They do not notice the small city growing quietly between them. By the time Sin-Mubalit's son ascends the throne, Babylon has spent 5 generations preparing, without knowing what it is preparing for. His name is Hammurabi, and he ascends the throne of Babylon around 1792 before the Common Era, a young king inheriting a city that is still, by every measure, a minor power. Larsa dominates the south. Eshnunna controls the Diyala River Valley to the northeast. Mari commands the upper Euphrates trade routes. Assyria broods in the north. Elam watches from the highlands beyond the Tigris. Babylon sits among them like a reed in a field of swords. The young king does not reach for the sword. For nearly 3 decades Hammurabi builds. He dredges canals, strengthens walls, expands temples. He names his early regnal years not after conquests, but after the digging of waterways and the dedication of thrones to gods. A canal called Hammurabi as the abundance of the people carries Euphrates water to fields that had gone dry. Grain stores fill, the population grows, tax revenues increase. Babylon becomes prosperous before it becomes powerful. His diplomacy is patient and calculating. Letters recovered from the palace archives at Mari reveal a king who corresponds constantly, flatters strategically, and commits to alliances only when the advantage is clear. He cultivates friendship with Zimri-Lim of Mari, exchanging gifts, intelligence, and military support. He watches as the great powers around him exhaust themselves in wars against each other. He waits. The waiting ends around 1764 before the Common Era. Rim-Sin of Larsa, the aged king who has ruled the south for decades, overextends himself. Hammurabi strikes. In a series of campaigns compressed into just a few years, the transformation is staggering. Larsa falls, Eshnunna is conquered, the armies of Babylon push north. By 1761, Hammurabi turns against his former ally Zimri-Lim, besieging and destroying the magnificent palace at Mari, a structure of over 260 rooms, its walls painted with elaborate frescoes, its archives holding thousands of cuneiform tablets that would one day reveal the inner workings of Bronze Age diplomacy. Assyria submits. From the Persian Gulf to the Middle Euphrates, Mesopotamia answers to Babylon. But Hammurabi's genius extends beyond the battlefield. He reorganizes provincial administration, appoints governors, standardizes weights and measures, and personally adjudicates legal disputes through letters sent to local officials. He is an administrator of extraordinary energy, attending to irrigation schedules, property disputes, and temple maintenance with equal intensity. And then there is the code. Carved into a stele of black diorite standing 2¼ meters tall, the Code of Hammurabi gathers 282 laws governing nearly every dimension of Babylonian life. Property rights, commercial contracts, wages for laborers and physicians, marriage and divorce, inheritance, adoption, assault, theft, agricultural disputes, the responsibilities of builders whose structures collapse. At its summit, a relief depicts Hammurabi standing before Shamash, the sun god and divine patron of justice, receiving the authority to govern. The prologue declares Hammurabi chosen by the gods to make justice prevail in the land, to destroy the wicked, and to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak. The epilogue warns future kings not to alter his judgments. The principle of proportional retribution runs through the text, an eye for an eye, a bone for a bone, though punishments vary sharply by social class. The code distinguishes between the free citizen, the dependent, and the slave. It is not the oldest law code, the Code of Ur-Nammu precedes it by 3 centuries, but it is the most comprehensive legal document the ancient world has yet produced. Alongside the law, Marduk rises. Hammurabi elevates Babylon's patron deity from a local god of no special rank to the head of the Mesopotamian pantheon. The theological argument is simple and powerful. Marduk has granted Babylon dominion, therefore Marduk must be supreme among gods. The Esagila temple complex at the city's heart becomes the spiritual center of an empire. Hammurabi dies around 1750 before the Common Era, after 42 years on the throne. He leaves behind a unified Mesopotamia, a legal tradition that will echo across millennia, and a city that has become, for the first time, the undisputed center of the world between the rivers. The mud-brick walls of Babylon now enclose something no previous dynasty achieved. A state built not only on conquest, but on codified order, administered law, and a theology that binds political power to divine will. Within the walls that Hammurabi raised, within the order his laws imposed, a civilization breathes. The city of Babylon in the decades following his reign is not merely a seat of power. It is a living organism of streets, courtyards, temples, and canals, home to a society more intricately organized than any the world has yet known. The population divides into 3 recognized tiers. At the summit stand the Awilim, free citizens of full legal standing, landowners, officials, priests, and wealthy merchants whose injuries demand the highest compensations under the law. Below them, the Mushkinum occupy an ambiguous middle rank, free but dependent on palace or temple institutions for their livelihood, their legal protections slightly diminished, their fines and penalties calculated at lower rates. At the base, the Wardum, slaves, labor in households, fields, and workshops. Yet slavery in Old Babylon is not the absolute condition later centuries will impose elsewhere. Slaves may own property, conduct business, and purchase their own freedom. The law code specifies penalties for those who help slaves escape, but also mandates protections against abuse. The household is the fundamental unit. A typical Old Babylonian home is built of sun-dried mud brick around a central courtyard open to the sky. Rooms radiate inward, a reception chamber, sleeping quarters, storage areas, and often a small domestic chapel with clay figurines of protective spirits. Cooking happens in the courtyard or a side kitchen, and the flat roof serves as sleeping space in the brutal summer heat. Wealthier families plaster their interior walls and lay baked brick floors. Marriage is a contractual affair, negotiated between families and recorded on clay tablets. A bride brings a dowry, silver, furniture, textiles, sometimes slaves, that remains legally hers. If her husband divorces her without cause, she takes it back. Women of the Awilum class may own property, run businesses, lend silver at interest, and appear in court. The Naditu priestesses of the god Shamash at Sippar manage substantial commercial portfolios, buying and selling fields, lending grain and silver, and accumulating wealth that rivals that of male merchants. They are forbidden to bear children, yet they adopt heirs and wield considerable social influence. Boys destined for the scribal profession enter the Aduba, the tablet house, as young children. There they copy sign lists, practice wedge impressions in soft clay, memorize Sumerian vocabulary, for Sumerian remains the language of scholarship, even as Akkadian dominates daily speech. Advanced students progress to mathematics, solving problems that modern notation would express as quadratic equations. They study omen texts, cataloging the meaning of liver shapes, celestial events, and the behavior of oil on water. They copy literary masterworks. The Epic of Gilgamesh circulates in old Babylonian versions that will endure for 1,000 years. Beyond the scribal schools, the markets of Babylon pulse with commerce. Silver serves as the standard of exchange, weighed in shekels on balanced scales. Merchants import tin from the east and textiles from workshops across the south, trading them for copper, timber, and stone that the alluvial plain cannot provide. Beer, brewed from barley bread fermented in water, flavored with date syrup, is the daily drink of every class, consumed through long reed straws from communal jars. Brewers, many of them women, operate under regulations specified in the law code, with harsh penalties for those who overcharge or dilute their product. The agricultural year governs everything. Barley and emmer wheat grow in fields irrigated by canals that branch from the Euphrates in an engineered network requiring constant maintenance. Date palms line the canal banks, their fruit a staple food, their wood essential for construction. Farmers pay taxes in grain to the palace and temple, and the great institutional households of the Esagila redistribute food, wool, and oil to dependent workers. At the center of the city's spiritual life stands the Esagila, the temple of Marduk. Priests perform daily rituals, washing, clothing, and feeding the divine statue with offerings of bread, beer, meat, and fruit. Festivals punctuate the calendar, the greatest being the spring New Year celebration, when hymns praising Marduk's supremacy echo through the temple courtyards. The Enuma Elish, the creation epic composed to glorify Marduk's ascent among the gods, is recited in its entirety during these rites, binding theology to political legitimacy in a single ceremonial act. This is the world the law code governs and the temples sanctify, a world of barley fields and silver loans, of reed styluses and beer jars, of priestesses managing estates and scribes solving equations. It will endure, in its essential forms, for generations after Hammurabi's death, even as the dynasty he founded slowly weakens and new powers gather beyond the horizon. Those new powers arrive not from the familiar rivalries of the plain, but from distant mountains. Around 1595 before the Common Era, the Hittite king Mursili I leads his army southward from Anatolia in a campaign of astonishing reach. His forces descend the Euphrates, bypass every fortified city between Aleppo and the heartland, and strike Babylon itself. The raid is swift and devastating. Hittite soldiers breach the walls, plunder the temples, and carry away the golden statue of Marduk, the divine heart of the city, the very image before which Hammurabi's successors had knelt for generations. Then, As suddenly as they came, the Hittites withdraw, dragging their spoils northward through the Syrian corridor, leaving behind a capital gutted of its sacred core. The dynasty Hammurabi founded, already weakened by territorial losses and canal neglect under his later successors, does not survive the blow. The first dynasty of Babylon ends in smoke and silence, but the city does not remain empty. Into the vacuum steps a people whose origins remain among the most obscure in ancient Near Eastern history, the Kassites. They had appeared in Babylonian records as early as the reign of Hammurabi's successor, mentioned as laborers and mercenaries filtering down from the Zagros highlands. Now, with no native dynasty to oppose them, Kassite leaders seize the Babylonian throne and establish a ruling house that will endure for over 4 centuries, the longest single dynasty in Mesopotamian history. The Kassite kings do not destroy what they inherit. They absorb it. They adopt the Akkadian language for administration, maintain the scribal schools, restore the temples, and honor Marduk as supreme deity. A king named Agum II, perhaps within a generation of the Hittite raid, recovers the stolen statue of Marduk and returns it to the Esagila temple, an act of restoration that legitimizes Kassite rule in the eyes of the Babylonian priesthood. The city breathes again. Under Kassite governance, Babylon enters a period of quiet stability rarely celebrated, but historically remarkable. Kurigalzu I constructs an entirely new royal capital, Dur-Kurigalzu, northwest of Babylon, crowned by a massive ziggurat whose eroded core still rises from the Iraqi plain. Kassite artisans develop a distinctive tradition of carved boundary stones, kudurus, upright slabs of dark stone inscribed with royal land grants and adorned with the symbols of gods, the crescent of Sin, the 8-pointed star of Ishtar, the horned serpent of Marduk. These stones serve as legal documents and sacred monuments simultaneously, marking property rights under divine protection. Babylon under the Kassites becomes a player in the great international system of the Late Bronze Age. The Amarna letters, discovered in Egypt, reveal Kassite King Bernaburiash II corresponding as an equal with the Egyptian pharaoh, exchanging gold, lapis lazuli, horses and chariots, negotiating royal marriages, and complaining bitterly when diplomatic gifts fall short of expectations. Babylon trades with the Hittites, with Assyria, with Elam, and with the kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean. Cuneiform scholarship flourishes. Scribes copy and preserve the great literary works of the Sumerian and Old Babylonian traditions, ensuring their survival across centuries. Yet the Kassite world is not without threat. Assyria, once a vassal, grows steadily more powerful to the north. Elam, the ancient rival beyond the Zagros, watches from the east. Around 1155, before the Common Era, the Elamite king Shutruk-Nahunta launches a catastrophic invasion. His armies sweep through Babylonia, sacking cities, toppling the last Kassite king, and carrying away treasures accumulated over millennia, among them the very stele of Hammurabi, transported to the Elamite capital of Susa, where it will lie buried for 3,000 years until French archaeologists unearth it in 1901. The statue of Marduk is seized once more, dragged into Elamite captivity for a second time. The Kassite dynasty, which had quietly preserved Babylonian civilization through 4 centuries of upheaval, collapses. Babylon stands plundered again, its temples emptied, its god in exile. But the city's cultural gravity remains unbroken, pulling new rulers toward its altars, demanding restoration, demanding continuity, demanding that whoever holds its throne must first kneel before the memory of what Babylon has always been. That pull is answered almost immediately. From the wreckage of Kassite collapse, a native Babylonian dynasty emerges, the second dynasty of Isin, and among its kings rises one whose name will echo across 1,000 years. Nebuchadnezzar I ascends the throne around 1125 before the Common Era, inheriting a humiliated kingdom, its patron god still captive in Elamite hands. The absence of Marduk is not merely symbolic. Without the divine statue, the New Year festival cannot be performed, the king's authority cannot be ritually renewed, and the cosmic order that Babylon claims to anchor remains fractured. Nebuchadnezzar understands that recovering Marduk is not a matter of piety alone. It is the prerequisite for political legitimacy itself. He marches east. The campaign against Elam is desperate and audacious, launched across punishing terrain in the brutal heat of a Mesopotamian summer. Later texts describe the moment in almost mythic terms, the king crossing rivers swollen with seasonal floods, his army exhausted, the sun itself described as his ally. He strikes deep into Elamite territory, defeats the enemy forces, and recovers the statue of Marduk. The god returns to Babylon in triumph. The Esagila temple receives its lord again, and Nebuchadnezzar I is celebrated as a liberator king, a restorer of divine order. Poets compose hymns in his honor. His reign becomes the golden memory that later Babylonians will invoke whenever their city suffers. But the second dynasty of Isin does not endure. Within decades of Nebuchadnezzar's death around 1104 before the Common Era, Babylon enters a prolonged period of political weakness. A succession of minor dynasties holds the throne: the Second Sealand dynasty, the Bazi dynasty, an Elamite interlude, none commanding authority beyond the city's immediate hinterland. Babylon remains culturally magnificent, its scribal schools active, its temples maintained, but it lacks the military power to defend its independence against the force gathering in the north. That force is Assyria. From their heartland along the upper Tigris, the Assyrian kings have been building a war machine of terrifying efficiency. By the 9th century before the Common Era, Assyrian armies campaign regularly into Babylonia, demanding tribute, installing compliant rulers, treating the ancient city as a vassal. The relationship is complex. Assyrian kings revere Babylonian culture, study its literature, worship its gods, and claim legitimacy through association with Marduk. Yet they refuse to tolerate Babylonian independence. The tension explodes under Tiglath-Pileser III, who seizes the Babylonian throne directly around 729 before the Common Era, ruling both kingdoms simultaneously. When Babylonian resistance flares under the Chaldean leader Merodach-Baladan, who briefly claims the throne with Elamite support, Assyria responds with overwhelming force. Sargon II recaptures Babylon. His successor Sennacherib faces yet another revolt and makes a decision that shocks the ancient world. In 689 before the Common Era, Sennacherib orders Babylon destroyed. His soldiers raze temples, breach canal walls to flood the ruins, and carry away sacred earth. The act is unprecedented, the deliberate annihilation of the most revered city in Mesopotamia by a king who claims to honor its gods. The horror reverberates through Assyrian consciousness itself. Sennacherib's own son Esarhaddon, who takes the throne after his father's assassination, immediately undertakes Babylon's reconstruction. He rebuilds the Esagila, restores temples, and resettles populations, presenting himself as the healer of his father's sacrilege. For a generation, Babylon breathes again under Assyrian patronage. Then comes the final catastrophe of this era. Ashurbanipal, Esarhaddon's son, divides the empire, placing his brother Shamash-shum-ukin on the Babylonian throne. In 652 before the Common Era, Shamash-shum-ukin revolts, forging alliances with Elam, Arab tribes, and Chaldean chieftains. Ashurbanipal besieges Babylon for 4 years. Famine consumes the city. In 648, Babylon falls. Shamash-shum-ukin perishes. Tradition says in the flames of his own palace. Ashurbanipal plunders but does not destroy the city entirely, recognizing what Sennacherib had learned too late. Babylon cannot be erased. Its temples are restored once more. Its scribes continue copying ancient texts. Its priests continue reading the stars. Beneath the shadow of Assyrian power, the city endures, waiting for the empire above it to crack. The crack comes swiftly. Ashurbanipal dies around 627 before the Common Era, and the Assyrian Empire, stretched across a territory from Egypt to the Zagros Mountains, begins to tear along every seam. Succession disputes fracture the royal court at Nineveh. Provincial governors sense weakness. Vassal states test their chains. And in the reed marshlands of the far south, where the Tigris and Euphrates dissolve into a labyrinth of waterways and date palm islands, a Chaldean tribal leader named Nabopolassar watches the empire's grip loosen. The Chaldeans are no strangers to rebellion. For generations, their tribal confederacies in the Sealand region have resisted Assyrian authority, retreating into marshes that no chariot army can penetrate. Nabopolassar emerges from this world of shallow waters and fierce independence. In 626 before the Common Era, he seizes the Babylonian throne and the Babylonian chronicle tablets, clay records of extraordinary precision, mark this moment as the founding of a new dynasty. Babylon, after centuries of subjugation, has a king who owes nothing to Nineveh. The war that follows is neither swift nor certain. For nearly a decade, Nabopolassar fights Assyrian forces across the Mesopotamian plain. Assyrian garrisons hold key cities. Egyptian pharaoh Psamtik I sends troops northward to prop up the faltering empire, recognizing that Assyria's collapse would reshape the entire ancient world. Nabopolassar suffers setbacks, losing engagements, retreating behind Babylon's walls. But he rebuilds, recruits, and above all, he finds an ally whose ambitions mirror his own. To the east, beyond the Zagros passes, the Median kingdom under Cyaxares has unified the Iranian plateau into a formidable military power. The Medes harbor their own grievances against Assyria. Generations of border warfare, tribute demands, and Assyrian campaigns into their highlands. Around 614 before the Common Era, Median forces descend upon the ancient city of Ashur, the spiritual heart of the Assyrian Empire. The city falls. Its temples, among the oldest in Mesopotamia, burn. Nabopolassar arrives after the destruction is complete, and the two kings formalize their alliance, reportedly sealed by a dynastic marriage. The target now is Nineveh itself, the greatest city of the Assyrian world, ringed by massive walls stretching nearly 12 kilometers, fed by an elaborate aqueduct system, adorned with palaces whose carved reliefs depict the conquests of a dozen kings. In the spring of 612 before the Common Era, The combined Babylonian and Median armies, joined by Scythian contingents, encircle the city. The siege lasts approximately 3 months. The Kosa River, which flows through Nineveh, reportedly floods, breaching sections of the mud-brick fortifications. The allies pour through. The Assyrian king Sin-shar-ishkun perishes. Tradition holds he dies in his burning palace. Nineveh, the city that terrorized the ancient world for centuries, is sacked and left in ruins so thorough that within 2 generations, the Greek soldier Xenophon will march past its mounds without knowing what lies beneath. Yet Assyria does not die at Nineveh. A remnant army under Ashur-uballit II retreats westward to Haran, where Egyptian forces under Pharaoh Necho II march north to reinforce them. In 610 before the Common Era, Nabopolassar's forces take Haran. The Assyrian-Egyptian counterattack fails. The empire that had dominated the Near East for 3 centuries ceases to exist as a political entity. Nabopolassar, aging and ill, entrusts the final campaigns to his son, Crown Prince Nebuchadnezzar. In the summer of 605 before the Common Era, at Carchemish on the upper Euphrates, Nebuchadnezzar meets a large Egyptian army under Necho II. The battle is decisive and devastating. The Babylonian Chronicle records the destruction of the Egyptian force in terms of total annihilation. Nebuchadnezzar pursues the remnants southward through the Levant, establishing Babylonian authority over Syria and Palestine in a single campaign season. Word reaches him on the march: Nabopolassar has died in Babylon on the 8th of the month of Abu, 605 before the Common Era. The crown prince races home across the desert. Within 3 weeks he sits on the throne of Babylon, inheriting an empire that stretches from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt. The marshland rebel's son now commands the mightiest state in the known world. Babylon, so long a subject city, stands at the center of a dominion built from the ashes of its oppressor. The empire he inherits is vast, but the city at its heart is not yet worthy of it. Nebuchadnezzar understands this from the first year of his reign. Babylon must become more than a capital. It must become a monument, a declaration in mud brick and glazed tile that no power on earth can rival. And so begins the most ambitious building program the ancient world has ever seen, a transformation that will consume 4 decades and reshape the very meaning of urban grandeur. The work starts with the sacred. The Esagila, the temple of Marduk at the city's spiritual center, is rebuilt and lavished with gold, silver, and precious timber from Lebanon. Its inner sanctum, where the golden statue of Marduk sits enthroned, gleams with a richness meant to reflect the god's supremacy over all creation. Adjacent to the Esagila rises the Ziggurat Etemenanki, the temple of the foundation of heaven and earth, a stepped tower of 7 stages that climbs perhaps 91 meters into the Mesopotamian sky. Its base alone measures roughly 90 meters on each side. Fired bricks laid in bitumen mortar form its core, and a temple crowns its summit, sheathed in blue-glazed tile that catches the sun like a fragment of heaven brought to earth. Later generations, encountering its memory through scripture, will call it the Tower of Babel. But Nebuchadnezzar builds outward as well as upward. The city's inner walls, known as Imgur-Enlil and Nimiti-Enlil, are doubled and strengthened, an inner wall of mud brick nearly 7 meters thick, an outer wall of fired brick, and a moat fed by the Euphrates forming a 3rd line of defense. Beyond these, An outer wall system extends the fortified perimeter to enclose nearly 900 hectares, making Babylon the largest walled city on the planet. Towers punctuate the walls at regular intervals. The king himself records in his building inscriptions that no enemy shall ever breach these defenses. The Ishtar Gate stands as the ceremonial entrance to the inner city, and it is here that Nebuchadnezzar's vision achieves its most breathtaking expression. The gate rises 12 meters high, its surface covered in glazed bricks of deep lapis blue. Across this brilliant field stride rows of golden Mushushushu dragons, sacred to Marduk, and aurochs bulls, sacred to the storm god Adad, their forms molded in relief, their bodies shimmering in yellow and white against the blue. The processional way extends southward from the gate, its surface paved with limestone slabs over a foundation of basalt and brick. Walls of glazed brick line both sides, adorned with 60 striding lions in yellow, white, and red, symbols of Ishtar, goddess of war and love. During the annual Akitu festival, the statue of Marduk passes along this road in sacred procession, and the king walks before the god. Within the city, Nebuchadnezzar constructs 2 great palace complexes. The southern palace, his primary residence, contains the vast throne room, whose facade blazes with glazed brick friezes of striding lions, floral columns, and geometric borders in blue, yellow, and white. The northern palace, sometimes called the Summer Palace, sits at the city's edge near the outer fortifications. Between them, the city spreads in an ordered grid, bisected by the Euphrates, connected by a stone bridge, one of the earliest permanent river crossings in history. And then there are the gardens. Classical authors, Berossus, Diodorus Siculus, Strabo, describe terraced gardens rising in tiers above the city, irrigated by mechanical screws lifting water from the river, planted with trees and flowering plants that created the illusion of a forested mountainside in the flat Mesopotamian plain. Whether these hanging gardens stood in Babylon, or, as some scholars now argue, in Nineveh under Sennacherib, their association with Nebuchadnezzar's city has endured for millennia. Robert Coldewy, excavating the site between 1899 and 1917, uncovered the foundations of the Ishtar Gate, the processional way, the throne room, and the temple complexes, confirming in fired brick and broken tile what the ancient inscriptions had proclaimed. The city that emerges from the archaeological record is staggering in scale, a population between 100,000 and 200,000 souls, a canal network threading through residential quarters, temples to dozens of deities, and markets drawing goods from India to Egypt. Nebuchadnezzar has built not merely a capital, but the largest and most magnificent city the world has yet known. Beyond those magnificent walls, beyond the glazed lions and golden dragons, the empire radiates outward along ancient roads and river courses, sustained not by beauty alone, but by the disciplined application of military force and administrative control. Nebuchadnezzar II rules the largest territorial state Mesopotamia has known since the Assyrian collapse, and maintaining it demands constant vigilance across a crescent of conquered lands stretching from the marshes of the Persian Gulf to the dry hills overlooking Egypt. The Levant is the empire's most volatile frontier. In 597 before the Common Era, Nebuchadnezzar besieges Jerusalem for the first time, deposing King Jehoiakim's successor Jehoiachin after only 3 months on the throne. The young king, his family, and thousands of Judean elites Craftsmen, soldiers, priests are marched eastward across the Syrian desert to Babylon. Zedekiah, a Babylonian appointee, is placed on the Judean throne. Clay tablets recovered from the vaults beneath Nebuchadnezzar's southern palace record rations of oil and barley distributed to Jehoiachin, king of Judah, and his 5 sons, administrative receipts that confirm the biblical account with astonishing precision. But Zedekiah rebels. Encouraged by Egyptian promises of military support, he withholds tribute. Nebuchadnezzar's response is devastating. In 586 before the Common Era, Babylonian siege engines breach Jerusalem's walls after an 18-month blockade. The Temple of Solomon, standing for nearly 4 centuries, is burned to its foundations. The city is systematically dismantled. Zedekiah, captured fleeing toward Jericho, watches his sons executed before his own eyes are put out. Tens of thousands more are deported to Babylon. The event reshapes the religious consciousness of an entire people, giving birth to the theology of exile that will profoundly shape Judaism, Christianity, and Islam for millennia to come. Simultaneously, Babylonian forces besiege the island fortress of Tyre off the Phoenician coast. The siege endures for 13 years, an extraordinary commitment of resources that reflects the city's commercial importance. Whether Tyre ultimately falls or negotiates terms remains debated, but Babylonian administrative authority over the Phoenician coast is firmly established. The Wadi Brisa inscription, carved into a Lebanese mountainside, celebrates Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns and his harvesting of cedar timber from the very forests that once supplied Solomon. To the south, Egypt remains a persistent threat. Pharaoh Necho II and later Pharaoh Apris probe Babylonian positions in the Levant, occasionally emboldening local vassals to revolt. Nebuchadnezzar campaigns against Egypt itself, though the results appear inconclusive. The frontier stabilizes roughly along the Brook of Egypt, the traditional boundary between Asian and African spheres of influence. Administering this empire requires more than garrisons. Provincial governors oversee taxation and corvée labor across Babylonia, the Middle Euphrates, and the Levantine territories. Temple economies function as engines of production and redistribution. The Iana temple complex at Uruk manages vast agricultural estates, flocks of sheep numbering in the tens of thousands, and workshops producing textiles for export. The Esagila at Babylon collects offerings and rents from properties scattered across the empire. Silver functions as the primary medium of exchange, weighed in shekels and minas on standardized scales. Trade caravans arrive at Babylon's gates bearing incense from Arabia, copper from Oman, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, timber from Lebanon, linen from Egypt, and spices from routes reaching toward India. The Euphrates quays bustle with reed boats and bitumen-sealed barges carrying grain, dates, and sesame oil from the southern provinces. Deportee communities, Judeans, Phoenicians, Egyptians, and others, are settled on undeveloped lands along canals, tasked with bringing new agricultural territory into production. These populations retain elements of their identity, while contributing to the imperial economy, their labor recorded on the same clay tablets that track temple offerings and palace expenditures. The empire functions as a vast circulatory system, its arteries the rivers and roads, its heart the city of Babylon itself, where the wealth of conquered and traded lands accumulates in temple treasuries and palace storerooms. Every shekel of silver, every jar of oil, every bale of wool passes through networks of scribes whose reed styluses press accountability into wet clay. The Neo-Babylonian state does not merely conquer, it counts, records, and administers with a thoroughness inherited from 3,000 years of Mesopotamian bureaucratic tradition. Yet the true measure of Babylon lies not in the tribute it extracts, but in the life that pulses through its streets, courtyards, and temple precincts during these decades of supreme confidence. The city at the turn of the 6th century before the Common Era is home to perhaps 150,000 souls, making it the largest urban concentration on Earth. Its neighborhoods spread across both banks of the Euphrates, connected by a stone bridge resting on boat-shaped piers, and every quarter hums with the particular rhythms of commerce, devotion, and domestic routine. The residential houses of Babylon follow a pattern refined over millennia. Windowless mud-brick walls face the street, offering privacy and insulation against the brutal summer heat. Behind these blank facades, rooms open inward onto central courtyards where light and air circulate freely. Wealthier families plaster their interior walls with lime, lay baked brick floors, and maintain small household chapels where clay figurines of protective spirits stand in niches. Cooking happens in corner hearths. Water comes from private wells sunk through the courtyard floor. Families eat barley bread, date paste, onions, fish from the river, and occasionally mutton or goat, washed down with beer strained through reed filters. Among the most prosperous households is the Egibi family, whose archive of clay tablets, spanning 5 generations, reveals a private banking dynasty operating at the heart of Babylonian commerce. The Egibi firm lends silver at interest, manages agricultural estates, collects rents, trades in slaves, and handles complex financial instruments, including promissory notes and property transfers. Their tablets, sealed with cylinder seals pressed into clay envelopes, document transactions with temples, royal officials, and foreign merchants alike. They represent a sophistication of private enterprise that will not be matched in the Western world for centuries. On the temple platform of the Esagila, priests perform daily rituals for Marduk, washing, clothing, and feeding the god's cult statue with meals of roasted meat, beer, and fine bread. But the supreme expression of Babylonian religious life is the Akitu festival, celebrated over 11 days at the start of the new year in the month of Nisanu. On the 4th day, the high priest recites the entire Enuma Elish, the creation epic in which Marduk defeats the chaos goddess Tiamat and fashions the world from her body. On the 5th day, the king enters the Esagila, and the high priest strips him of his royal insignia, strikes his cheek, and pulls his ears. The king kneels before Marduk's statue and declares that he has not neglected the god's city. Only when tears flow from the king's eyes is his authority ritually restored. On subsequent days, Marduk's statue processes along the processional way through the Ishtar Gate to the Akitu house north of the city, accompanied by chanting priests, musicians, and vast crowds. High atop the temple towers, astronomer priests maintain nightly vigils, recording the positions of the moon, the 5 visible planets, and the stars in clay tablets known as astronomical diaries. These observations, accumulated over centuries, enable Babylonian scholars to predict lunar eclipses with remarkable accuracy and to track the 18-year Saros cycle. They develop mathematical models using arithmetic sequences to calculate planetary positions, techniques that will later flow into Greek astronomy through figures like Hipparchus. women in Babylon own property, initiate divorce proceedings, conduct business, and appear as witnesses in legal contracts. Slave sale documents specify prices, conditions, and guarantees against illness or prior claims. Manumission is possible through purchase or the owner's declaration before witnesses. The city's population includes not only native Babylonians, but Judean exiles settled in communities along the canals, Egyptian craftsmen, Lydian merchants, and peoples from every corner of the empire. Ration lists from the palace record distributions to individuals identified by their ethnic origins, confirming the cosmopolitan character of this extraordinary metropolis. Along the Euphrates quays, flat-bottomed boats and round coracles unload cargoes of timber from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and spices from Arabia. The river itself serves as the city's central artery, its waters diverted into canals that irrigate the surrounding date palm groves and grain fields stretching to the horizon. Babylon at its peak is not merely a capital of empire. It is a living organism of staggering complexity, a city where law, commerce, science, and faith interweave in patterns that will echo through every civilization that follows. Nebuchadnezzar II dies in the year 562 before the Common Era, and the greatest city on earth holds its breath. For 43 years, one will has governed everything: the temples, the armies, the canals, the provinces stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Egyptian frontier. Now that will is gone, and the empire discovers how much of its coherence depended on a single man. His son Amel-Marduk ascends the throne. The biblical tradition remembers him as evil Merodach, noting that he released the captive Judean king Jehoiachin from prison and gave him a place at the royal table. But whatever mercy or reform Amel-Marduk attempts, it earns him enemies among the military elite and the priesthood. Within 2 years, he is dead, murdered in a palace conspiracy led by his own brother-in-law, the general Neriglissar. Neriglissar proves competent. He campaigns in Cilicia, strengthens Babylon's western defenses, and undertakes building projects in the capital. But his reign lasts barely 4 years. When he dies around 556 before the Common Era, his young son Labashi-Marduk inherits the throne. The boy rules for only weeks, perhaps 2 months, before a faction of courtiers and priests eliminates him. 3 kings have fallen in 6 years. The dynasty Nebuchadnezzar built is consuming itself. From this chaos emerges Nabonidus, a man unlike any Babylonian king before him. He is not of the royal line. His mother, Adad-Gupi, was a priestess of the moon god Sin at the great temple in Haran, far to the northwest. Nabonidus carries her devotion like a flame. From the beginning of his reign, he elevates Sin above all other gods, commissioning restorations of Sin's temples at Haran and at lavishing resources on lunar cult centers, while the priests of Marduk at the Esagila watch with mounting alarm. The verse account of Nabonidus, a text almost certainly composed by his enemies after his fall, portrays him as a madman and a heretic, a king who neglected the supreme god of Babylon in favor of a foreign deity. Then Nabonidus does something unprecedented. Around 553 before the Common Era, he departs Babylon entirely, traveling south and west into the Arabian desert. He establishes himself at the oasis of Tamar, deep in the northwestern Arabian peninsula, and remains there for approximately 10 years. The reasons remain debated: control of lucrative incense trade routes, religious devotion to Sin at Arabian cult sites, or political exile forced by priestly opposition. Whatever the cause, the consequence is devastating. The Akitu festival, the 11-day New Year celebration upon which Babylon's cosmic order depends, cannot be performed without the king present. Year after year, the chronicle records the same grim notation. The festival did not take place. The ritual heart of Babylonian religion falls silent. In Babylon, Nabonidus leaves his son Belshazzar as regent. Belshazzar administers the empire, commands the garrison, and manages daily governance, but he lacks the title of king and cannot perform the sacred rites that legitimize royal authority. The temples grow restive. The merchant houses sense instability. The empire's outer provinces begin to drift, and to the east a force is gathering that will reshape the entire ancient world. Cyrus II of Persia, originally the vassal king of Anshan under Median overlordship, overthrows his Median sovereign Astyages around 550 before the Common Era, uniting the Medes and Persians into a single, formidable power. In 547, he conquers Croesus of Lydia, absorbing all of Anatolia. His empire now stretches from the Aegean Sea to the Iranian plateau. Only Babylon stands between Cyrus and total dominion over the ancient Near East. Nabonidus finally returns to Babylon around 543 before the Common Era, but the damage is done. The priesthood despises him. The people distrust him. The verse account accuses him of imposing forced labor, neglecting the gods, and ruling like a tyrant. Whether these charges are fair or merely the propaganda of a priesthood eager for a new master, they reflect a city fractured from within. The walls still tower. The Ishtar Gate still blazes blue and gold. The Euphrates still flows through the city's heart. But the confidence that animated Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon has drained away, replaced by anxiety and division. Somewhere beyond the Zagros Mountains, Cyrus is assembling his armies. The armies of Persia descend from the Zagros highlands in the late summer of 539 before the Common Era, and the speed of their advance catches the Babylonian command off guard. Cyrus has spent years preparing, absorbing the Median Empire, conquering Lydia, subjugating the Greek cities of Anatolia, and binding the eastern Iranian plateau under a single throne. Now the full weight of that consolidated power turns toward Mesopotamia. Nabonidus, back in Babylon after his long exile in Tamar, orders the statues of gods from outlying cities brought into the capital for safekeeping, a desperate measure that only deepens the resentment of provincial priesthoods who see their sanctuaries stripped bare. The decisive engagement comes at Opis, on the banks of the Tigris, in early October. The Nabonidus Chronicle, a cuneiform tablet composed shortly after the events it describes, records the battle with chilling brevity. The Babylonian army is routed. The chronicle notes a massacre of the population at Opis, though the precise scale remains uncertain. What is clear is that organized Babylonian military resistance effectively ends on that riverbank. The road to Babylon lies open. On the 12th of October, 539 before the Common Era, the Persian general Ugbaru, known in Greek sources as Gobrias, enters the city of Sippar without a battle. Not a single defender stands against him. 2 days later, on the 14th of October, Ugbaru's forces enter Babylon itself. The chronicle states plainly that the city was taken without fighting. The great walls, the moats, the fortified gates that Nebuchadnezzar had built to withstand any siege, none of them are tested. Later traditions, preserved by Herodotus and Xenophon, claim the Persians diverted the Euphrates into a basin upstream and waded into the city along the dry riverbed beneath the walls. Whether this account is historical or legendary, the essential fact remains. Babylon falls not in fire and destruction, but in a kind of exhausted surrender. Nabonidus flees and is captured. His fate afterward is obscure. Some sources suggest he was exiled to Carmania in eastern Persia. Cyrus himself enters Babylon on the 29th of October. The entrance is carefully staged. Green branches are spread before his path. The Nabonidus Chronicle records that peace was established and that Cyrus proclaimed well-being to the entire city. There is no looting, no burning of temples, no mass deportation. This is conquest reimagined as liberation. The ideological masterpiece of this moment is a barrel-shaped clay cylinder, roughly 23 centimeters long, deposited in the foundations of the Esagila temple. The Cyrus cylinder, discovered in 1879 by Hormuzd Rassam, presents the Persian king's own account, or rather the account his scribes composed in Babylonian cuneiform, using Mesopotamian literary conventions. The text declares that Marduk himself searched all lands for a righteous ruler and chose Cyrus, calling him by name. Nabonidus is condemned for neglecting the cult, oppressing the people, and imposing improper rituals. Cyrus, by contrast, restores the gods to their sanctuaries, returns deported peoples to their homelands, and repairs the temples. The cylinder does not mention the Jews by name, but the biblical book of Ezra records that Cyrus issued a decree permitting the exiled Judeans to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, an act that would reshape the trajectory of 3 world religions. Babylon does not die. Under Achaemenid rule, the city retains its status as one of the empire's most important administrative capitals. The temples continue to function. The scribes continue to inscribe cuneiform. The Akitu festival is still celebrated. The Egibi banking house continues its transactions well into the Persian period. Babylon remains vast, wealthy, and culturally vibrant. But sovereignty, the power to determine its own destiny, to crown its own kings, to wage its own wars, that is gone. The last independent Babylonian king has been led away in captivity. Persian governors now sit in the palaces that Nebuchadnezzar built. The Ishtar Gate still blazes blue under the Mesopotamian sun, but the soldiers who pass beneath it carry Persian spears. An era that began with Nabopolassar's revolt against Assyria, barely 90 years earlier, has ended. The gate of the gods stands open, and new masters walk through. New masters walk through, but the city they inherit refuses to diminish overnight. Under Achaemenid rule, Babylon retains its status as one of the empire's most important administrative centers. Darius I, who seizes the Persian throne in 522 before the Common Era, faces immediate rebellion. A Babylonian named Nidintu-Bel claims to be Nebuchadnezzar III and rallies the city against Persian authority. Darius crushes the revolt, and within months another pretender, Araka, raises Babylon again under the name Nebuchadnezzar IV. Darius suppresses this second uprising with brutal efficiency. Yet even after these revolts, he does not destroy the city. He uses Babylon as a winter capital, maintains its temples, and respects its ancient institutions. The Esagila still functions. The astronomical observers still climb the temple towers at dusk to record the positions of the planets. The true blow falls under Xerxes. After yet another Babylonian revolt around 484 before the Common Era, Xerxes reportedly divides the satrapy of Babylonia, strips the city of special privileges, and, according to later Greek sources, damages the Esagila and removes the golden statue of Marduk. The Akitu festival, which required the statue's presence, can no longer be performed in its traditional form. Whether Xerxes truly melted the statue remains debated, but the symbolic wound is deep. Babylon continues as a great city, still populous, still wealthy, but its sacred heart has been violated. Then comes Alexander. The Macedonian king enters Babylon in 331 before the Common Era, after his victory over Darius III at Gaugamela. The city opens its gates without resistance. Alexander sacrifices to Marduk, orders the restoration of the Esagila, and envisions Babylon as the eastern capital of his world empire. For a brief moment, the city's fortunes seem to reverse. Alexander commissions the clearing of silt from the Ziggurat Etemenanki, plans a grand harbor on the Euphrates, and stations his fleet along the river. Babylon buzzes with soldiers, engineers, and diplomats from Macedonia, Persia, India, and Egypt. But on the 10th or 11th of June, 323 before the Common Era, Alexander dies of fever in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. He is 32 years old. The plans for Babylon's renewal die with him. The wars of Alexander's successors tear the empire apart. Babylon becomes a battleground between rival generals. Seleucus I eventually secures Mesopotamia and founds a new capital, Seleucia on the Tigris, around 305 before the Common Era, barely 60 kilometers to the north. The founding of Seleucia is the wound from which Babylon never recovers. Population drains steadily toward the new city. Merchants relocate. Administrators follow. The great houses empty. The canals that sustained Babylon's agriculture begin to silt without adequate maintenance. Yet something remarkable persists. Within the crumbling precinct of the Esagila, a small community of priests and scholars continues to observe the heavens and inscribe cuneiform tablets. Babylonian astronomical diaries, meticulous records of planetary positions, weather, river levels, and commodity prices continue to be produced for centuries under Seleucid and then Parthian rule. The latest securely dated cuneiform text comes from approximately 75 before the Common Era. These final tablets represent one of the longest continuous scientific traditions in human history, stretching back over 1,000 years. By the Parthian period, Babylon is a small settlement scattered among enormous ruins. Travelers describe crumbling walls, sand-choked canals, and empty palaces where wind moves through roofless chambers. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, describes the Temple of Marduk as still standing, but the rest of the city as reduced to desolation. Strabo, writing slightly earlier, notes that the great city has become a desert. The glazed bricks of the Ishtar Gate still catch the light, but fewer and fewer eyes remain to see them. The Euphrates itself shifts its course, moving away from the city's ancient channel. Date palms grow wild in abandoned courtyards. Dust settles on the processional way. By the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era, Babylon is effectively abandoned. A vast field of mounds rising from the alluvial plain, silent under the Mesopotamian sky, waiting for the millennia to pass before anyone comes to ask what lies beneath. The mounds endure. For more than 1,000 years after the last inhabitants depart, Babylon exists only as a name, but what a name it becomes. In Jewish scripture, shaped during and after the exile of the 6th century before the Common Era, Babylon crystallizes into something far larger than a city. It is the furnace of suffering, the place where the psalms of longing are composed beside foreign rivers, the imperial power that destroyed Solomon's temple. The Book of Daniel sets its visions within Babylonian palaces. The Book of Revelation, written centuries later, transforms the name into a cosmic symbol, the great harlot seated upon many waters, the embodiment of worldly corruption destined for divine destruction. Through these texts, Babylon enters the permanent vocabulary of Christianity and Islam alike, a byword for pride, excess, and the fragility of earthly dominion. The Tower of Babel, drawn from memories of the Ziggurat et Menanche, becomes the universal parable of human overreach. The city that crumbled into dust achieves an immortality its builders never imagined. For centuries, the physical site lies beneath wind-scoured tells on the Iraqi plain, visited occasionally by Arab geographers who note the mounds and move on. Then European travelers begin to arrive. Pietro della Valle reaches the ruins in 1616, collecting inscribed bricks he cannot read. Claudius James Rich, the British resident in Baghdad, surveys and maps the site in 1811, publishing the first modern descriptions. Austin Henry Layard, famous for his Assyrian excavations at Nimrud, draws further attention to Mesopotamia's buried cities. Meanwhile, the key to the ancient script unlocks. Henry Rawlinson, dangling from scaffolding on the cliff face at Behistun in Persia during the 1840s, copies the trilingual inscription of Darius the Great. His decipherment of Old Persian leads to the cracking of Babylonian cuneiform, and suddenly thousands of clay tablets begin to speak across millennia. The great excavation begins in 1899, when the German archaeologist Robert Koldewy arrives with a team that will work for 18 consecutive years. From the mounds emerge the processional way, the foundations of the Ishtar Gate, the throne room of Nebuchadnezzar, and the outlines of the Esagila temple complex. Glazed bricks depicting Mushoshu dragons and aurochs are carefully extracted, shipped to Berlin, and reassembled into the magnificent Ishtar Gate reconstruction that stands today in the Pergamon Museum. Babylon's most iconic monument displayed 5,000 kilometers from its original site. The 20th century brings new chapters of use and abuse. Saddam Hussein, styling himself a modern Nebuchadnezzar, orders a reconstruction of Babylon's walls beginning in the 1980s. New bricks are stamped with inscriptions bearing his name alongside the ancient kings, a pharaonic gesture that archaeologists condemn as damaging to the original stratigraphy. In 2003, following the invasion of Iraq, a United States military base called Camp Alpha is established directly on the archaeological site. Heavy vehicles compact ancient deposits, helicopter landing zones disturb fragile structures, and sandbags are filled with soil containing pottery fragments thousands of years old. International outcry eventually leads to the base's closure, but the damage lingers. Yet recognition follows. In 2019, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization inscribes Babylon as a World Heritage Site, acknowledging its outstanding universal value after decades of Iraqi advocacy. The deepest legacy, however, requires no monument. Every hour divided into 60 minutes, every circle measured in 360 degrees, every legal code that governs a modern state, all carry the fingerprints of Babylonian thought. The astronomical diaries kept by priests at the Esagila enabled the prediction of eclipses and the tracking of planetary cycles, knowledge that passed to Greek astronomers and onward into the scientific revolution. The principle that law should be written, public, and systematic, first realized on Hammurabi's stele, remains the foundation of civilized governance. Babylonian literary traditions, mathematical innovations, and cosmological frameworks flowed through Persian, Hellenistic, and eventually Islamic and European channels, shaping the intellectual architecture of the modern world. The city is gone, the empire is dust, but Babylon's mind endures in every clock, every courtroom, every star chart, and every story ever told about the rise and fall of human ambition. Thank you for joining this journey through the full arc of Babylon's extraordinary history. If these stories have sparked curiosity, consider subscribing to the channel so future explorations of the ancient world find their way to you.